Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to cover a full Shiny for Python course. So if you're not familiar with Shiny for Python, it is a robust, easy to use, and efficient way to build web applications and dashboards with Python. It's comparable to platforms like Streamlit or Plotly Dash, but for reasons that we'll dive into in this course, I find myself using it probably more frequently than any other framework at this point in time. This course was originally posted on the Posit YouTube channel, but I wanted to share it with all of you, so I've compiled all of the videos in that series into a single video course. In this course, we will cover all of the key concepts that you need to know when working with Shiny for Python. We'll start with the basics on how to quickly build, share, and deploy a Shiny for Python application in 20 minutes approximately. And then as we progress through the different parts of the course, we'll see how we can really build a professional looking dashboard. We'll learn how to combine many different types of Python visualizations into a single cohesive unit. And then we'll learn how to use HTML and CSS to style this and really make it your own. A high-level timeline with all of the different parts can be seen right here. And then a detailed timeline can be found in the description. My recommendation is break this video up into parts, maybe watch one part today, another part tomorrow, and I do recommend coding alongside. Links to the GitHub repo and all of the code can also be found in the description. I do want to say a quick thank you to Posit for sponsoring this video. In addition to open source offerings such as Shiny, Posit also has a suite of professional products, including Posit Connect, that make it easy to deploy all of your Python applications, whether that be Shiny, Streamlit, Fast API, Flask, etc. To learn more about how Posit Connect can help your organization deploy applications at scale, check out the link in the description. All right, let's get into the full Shiny for Python course. To get started, I recommend checking out the link in the description, which will bring you to this homepage that you see here. One thing that I think is worth just mentioning real quick is that there's this gallery that has all sorts of different projects that you can build in Shiny. A common project you might want to build is a dashboard. So here we see a restaurant tipping dashboard. It's interactive. I can toggle these different things. I can uncheck dinner, and we can see how everything changes. We can also build even more complex things, such as this Super Zip Explorer that looks at all of the zip codes in the United States, and it kind of ranks them and evaluates them on these different criteria that you see over here on the right side. So if I zoom in, the area kind of updates, and we can see that, like, if I wanted to, let's say, zoom in on this area of Philadelphia, I can see these different zip codes, and then I can even go into this Data Explorer and kind of evaluate them a little bit more, I guess, concretely. In this video series, we're going to specifically be working on building a dashboard that looks kind of like this. It's going to be on sales data, but we'll focus on something very simple for this first video just to get started. On this same homepage, there's another area you can go to, which is Playground, where we can start seeing code samples and actually really getting started super quickly. So go to the Playground. Again, links are in the description. And the first thing we see is just like a toggle bar here that is using Shiny. As we see, as we update this toggle, we see that it is doing n times 2, so 52, 104. It's interactive, cool. You probably want to do something a little bit more complex than that. So next we can look at like apps with plots. Same type of, scroll bar, or what do you call this? Toggle bar? Input slider, I guess we'll use the actual name. And we can see that the graph updates. And as you go down, you can get into very complex things like even building a Wordle app via Shiny. Really cool stuff. I recommend exploring these different apps that you can use. You can use Plotly, Altair, any of your favorite Python graphing libraries. But we'll start with this app with a plot. This is cool, but it's just random data. So kind of a starting point that I recommend is using this playground and actually building something that might be meaningful to you. Also linked in the description is a GitHub repo, and in that repo we can access some just simple CSV data. So this is students, and it's some test scores on a random exam. So one way that I might spin up a Shiny app really quickly is I might take this data, so I'll call this test scores.csv. I'll paste it in. And you can, add files right here in this little playground area. I'll save that. And then I can actually reference that data by doing something like df equals, let's do a couple things. We're going to want to import pandas probably. Import pandas as PD. We'll probably want to be able to access this easier using the pathlib. So pathlib import path. And I can access this file by doing file path equals path file. So this is the file we're currently editing, .parent. So it's the parent directory. And then I can simply do test scores.csv. And then I can load this file in with pandas by doing pd.read csv file path. And then instead of this histogram here, we can very easily have our data be set to test scores equals df. And then if we looked at that, the column was score, df score. Maybe we do even dot values, pass in the test scores, and we're going to just rerun this application. Oh, sorry. Kind of a special syntax here. Test scores.csv. And we can see that this is the data from our test scores, and we can toggle the number of bins in our histogram very easily. You can see it kind of is a normal-ish distribution around, I would say, 80. Probably get a little bit more granularity there, with some people performing really well, and then as we zoom out, some people performing very much not as well. One really cool thing we can do here with Shiny is we can share this actual editor here in this application. So I'm going to share the application URL. I'll open up a new tab, paste that in. And in this URL, actually, everything that we have saved is already encoded. So you can just share this link. That's the easiest way to share a Shiny application quickly. You could also have shared the actual editor URL. One caveat here is I would just be careful to share anything that's like sensitive data. There was no actual names or anything involved in this test scores data frame, so I'm fine sharing it. It would probably be fine for a teacher to share it as long as it's been anonymized, but just kind of things to think about when you're sharing a link that has all your kind of code right there in the URL. Cool, that's a great starting point. Next, let's build something a little bit more, I guess, robust, or work our way up to something more robust. GitHub link is in the description. We're going to take this repo. We're going to clone it locally. So go ahead and open up a terminal window. I'm going to go into my code directory, and we can get this code locally by doing something like git clone and then pasting in that link. I already have this locally, so I'm going to skip this step. But we then would have a Shiny Python projects file here. And my next recommendation is to create a virtual Python environment to get all of the dependencies you need to run Shiny locally. So to do that, I'm going to run this command, which will create a virtual environment called Shiny in my ends folder. And then I can activate that by doing source ends shiny bin activate. If you don't understand what I'm doing here with this virtual environment, don't worry too much about it. A lot of these steps will work without necessarily doing this. It's just good practice to have a virtual environment like this. And then finally, in this repo, there is a requirements.txt file. So to get all of the Python dependencies, we're going to want to do a pip3 or pip, depending on what version you have, install -r requirements.txt, and that should install everything in our virtual environment. If you're curious what was in that requirements.txt, it's just the Python libraries that we'll need for these tutorials in this series. You can add more as you see fit. The important ones really are Shiny and Shiny widgets. I would say those are the most important, and maybe actually any widget as well. Cool, we have that. Next, use your code editor of choice. I personally like to use Visual Studio Code, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code and open up this repo within my Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to open. It's in code, Shiny Python projects. Go ahead and open that. And we're going to go into this sales folder. I'm going to create a new file there, and we'll call it app.py. Okay. If you're using Visual Studio Code, there's a couple things I recommend. If you do Command-Shift-P, if you're on a Mac, you can select your interpreter, and you can select that Shiny virtual environment we just set up. And also, the best way to run Shiny apps locally with Visual Studio Code is to go ahead and go to the extensions and look up Shiny. Go ahead and install this. Finally, we can go back to our app. And really, a good starting point is just to go ahead and copy that code that we saw in the Shiny examples. Maybe we'll do something a little bit different. Maybe let's do like a Plotly plot. Here we have some Plotly graphs. I'm going to go ahead and copy this code. I'm going to paste it into my app. And a great check is, does this work? So we should be able to run this right away, and it should work. So we can click once you have the extension installed, you can click this button here, and we see that the application does work. Cool. And this fillable option lets it kind of extend to fill the screen. If you're not using Visual Studio Code, there's other ways to run this. You can go ahead and do the following from your command line. So we are in the sales folder, and we can run something like Shiny run -jas reload launch browser. Our app we're in the app directory, so we could just do app.py, and we can go ahead and run this. I got this command from the Shiny docs, which are also linked in the description. And as you can see, it popped up on my other monitor, but we have our little interactive Plotly graph here running. But let's make this a little bit more custom to us. Let's add some extra features and whatnot. So let's look at the docs. And we're using Shiny Express specifically. So Shiny Express Python. I recommend going to components. We can see all these different things we can use. You also might want to check out like layouts. A lot of interesting things here. And templates also have a lot of cool stuff that you can do and kind of get off the ground running with. And if you click on these, I'll show you exactly how to do it. But we'll specifically look at our reference. We can start by actually filling in a title that's more applicable. So we can say sales dashboard video 1 of 5. Save that. Another thing we'll probably want to do is edit our tab here, what shows up if you launch this in the browser. So we might have that be the same thing. I recommend going to the documentation to see this type of stuff. So looking at the documentation for the page ops that we're playing with, we see that the title here, and we also, by doing that, it defaults the window title, which is this little tab thing we're seeing here, to whatever the title is. So I'm happy with that within our app. Let's maybe add, let's make this custom to our data. So a good starting point with our data is we can go to the examples. We can see someone read a CSV. Let's just copy this. You can look at this code as you see fit, but we're going to paste this in. Now we have our data frame, and we need to import some libraries and make some fixes. So import pandas as PD. We're going to need to import reactive specifically. So maybe we just copy in what the imports they had there too. And then let's just clean this up. So delete this. Add this. Move this to the top. Doesn't really matter where this is positioned. And this is duplicate, right? I guess we might want to have render. Cool. And let's make a custom graph that's specific to our sales data. So this should be data/sales CSV. This would be pd.read CSV. And then finally, we can make something a little bit different here. So how would we do df equals the data, our sales data, And we'll set this to df. We don't want a histogram. Let's do a bar chart. X will be the, if you look at our sales data, product. And the Y data will be the number sold. So we'll probably have to do some processing on this. We'll do df.group by product.count. See this again. Good starting point is to render a data frame. See what's in our data frame. And maybe we just group by the product and we aggregate the quantity ordered. So we get, let's make a graph of the most popular products. So group by product, get the quantity ordered, and we're going to get, could do the count. We could also do n largest. Just take 5, let's say. That'll be our new top sales, we'll call this. And then finally, this will be top sales product, and we might have to reset the index. Y will be quantity ordered. And let's see what this gives us. Comment out this data frame for now. Notice I missed something small here. I actually wanted to sum the quantity ordered and then take the 5 largest. This should update my chart. That's what I'm expecting. Cool. And then I think as a last thing that we might want to just see real quick, I could very easily add some sort of input slider or input numeric. How about let's do, call this n, label it number of items. We'll give it a default value of 5, but we'll say the range can be from 1 to 20. And one thing that's cool that you can do with Shiny is that I can immediately, we'll see that this should pop up. I'll do min equals 0. Max equals 20. We can increase this number. And then finally, one thing that's cool is that we could replace this 5 with the value. And we grab the value by doing input that we imported here. And then this is the variable name. So in this case, it's n. So input.n will then allow us to showcase a specific number of items in our chart. And as we can see, as I increase this, we see more and more items. Cool. So that's a basic app that was built using Shiny for Python. So now, next step finally is how could we deploy this to have a link that anyone could access? Quick side note, the best way to deploy will depend on your Shiny app and who you want to share it with. For example, if data security and authentication are top of mind for you, or you work in a larger organization, you might want to consider some of the professional Posit options, such as Posit Connect, that can be found under self-hosted deployments. Alternatively, if you're just getting started and building a small public Shiny app, Shinylive or shinyapps.io are great options. You can find all the information under the deploy button here on the homepage. For now, we're going to go to shinyapps.io and deploy there. You'll want to log in, create an account if you don't have one, sign up with Google quick. So I'm creating an account on shinyapps.io. Maybe we'll call this like Keith Shiny. I already have an account, so this is kind of just to show you the process you'll follow. Follow these steps. So you want to set up RS Connect on your account, and we probably will want to start with Python. Install this. That should be included in the pip, the requirements.txt. You want to add this once you've done that, and then you can deploy using this command. Again, I already have an account that's separate from this one, so I'll be using that for the purpose of this. I just wanted to show you those steps. So we can go ahead. We're in our sales folder. We have our app.py. I'm going to paste in that command we just saw. It will know to find the app, so I'm going to just do / because we're already in that folder. The name, it's actually, my account is Keith Galli. And then we give this a title. The title we'll say is Sales Video 1. If I run this command, we see that it is building, installing files. We also see that we got this warning about the requirements.txt file not being in that repo. So it actually might be the best play to have this requirements.txt and actually put it directly in the sales folder and just have a requirements.txt in each of the projects that we're building. Minute detail, but installing files. Basically, the requirements.txt lets us deploy this and lets Shiny know what our requirements are when we deploy this to the cloud. And if we go to that Shiny Apps, shinyapps.io, go to our account, we'll see that this new application that we just built is being deployed. Oh no. I think it got annoyed because of not having the requirements.txt. So I'm going to try this one more time. You're allowed 5 free applications. And then you can upgrade your account to always access more applications. So let's try that command again. And we now have our requirements.txt in that repo. And we can see that it's now deploying. It's gone through the necessary installation steps, and it is deploying our instance. And look at that. We now have our sales dashboard right here online. You can share this link. You can edit this, ready to go. So, hey, we built this application. We shared it both with the URL using that student test score data, and then we also saw how we could actually deploy this to a web URL with our more sophisticated sales dashboard start. In the next videos in this series, we will build off of this. We will really drill into this reactive components and what we can do with these reactive components. We'll see how we can stylize our dashboards to make them way more interesting and way more pretty. And we'll work on some other features, seeing how we can combine many different types of plots, many different types of visuals to make this a really impressive looking application. Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to build off of the last tutorial where we learned the basics of building, sharing, and deploying a Shiny app in Python. This video specifically will focus on reactivity in Shiny, and you can totally watch this video as a standalone, but also it may be helpful to watch the previous video. Either option works totally fine. So in this video series, we're ultimately working our way towards a dashboard that looks like this. It's got a bunch of different Python visualizations all nicely put together in a Shiny app. But in this specific video, we'll kind of see how we can create little toggle options like this and play around with these different types of components that can make our visualizations and our Python apps dynamically update based on input variables. I think it's going to be a fun tutorial. Let's get right into it. Okay, to start, I recommend going to the description to access the finished code from part 1 of the tutorial. And as a reminder, the kind of basic app we spun up in that one just kind of looked like this. You could toggle this number of items, and it's just displaying some mock sales data from around the United States. So in this one, we're going to kind of see how we can take these toggle inputs, like this numeric input that I'm currently playing with, and just do more fancy things, and also just understand more in depth on how this operates and how Shiny renders different visualizations and items on your screen. So GitHub link in the description. You can fork and clone that to get started with the code that you see on the screen. If you don't know how to fork and clone, feel free to leave a comment on the video and I'll do my best to keep an eye out and help out anyone that is struggling with that. A little technical thing that I'm going to do real quick is just create a new branch. I'll call it video 2. All right, so what do we want to do here? Well, we want to have more numeric inputs, more types of input selectors, and maybe add another visualization to what we have on the screen now. How do we do that with Shiny? Well, I think a good starting point is to go into the Shiny for Python homepage. And the types of things that we can access are easily visible, and there's a lot of good template code if you go into components and then click on components. So on this screen, you see a bunch of different types of inputs. We currently have this numeric input on our screen, but as you can see, there's many other types of options that we could use. So let's play around with a couple of them. But for any of these, you can go ahead and click on the reference. It brings you to the documentation, and then you can kind of see how it's used in practice, and you can even play around with the input. Pretty cool, pretty helpful documentation there. So that is kind of what we're playing around with. And again, if you are having trouble rendering the Shiny app, check out the first video in the series linked in the description that will get you started with everything you see here so you're not lost. All right, yeah, let's add another graph. I mean, right now we're just plotting items in our sales data frame that we have here. That's part of the GitHub repo. So maybe we would want to do some more sophisticated visualizations as part of this app. And I mean, we're ultimately building something like this. So maybe we take one of these dashboards, how about the sales by city, and we start creating this with reactive components. So if I toggle this, we can see that the different cities update in the amount of sales per month. All right, so what do we need to do? Well, I think a good starting point with Shiny apps from my perspective is I kind of like to get the things that I'm building onto the screen, and then I can kind of toy around with them and make it look all pretty kind of after the fact. So that's going to be kind of the focus, is let's get the code on the screen and then we can fix things up and make it look good. So I'm going to temporarily remove this layout columns and just kind of throw everything in a line on the screen. We'll get into kind of the layout columns and some of those components that are used to lay out and kind of make your code look formatted nicely in one of the upcoming videos. I think it's actually the next video. All right, so how about we render another Plotly graph, and we'll call this one, maybe have it a little bit more descriptive of a name than plot 1. We'll call it sales by city. Or sales by city, sales over time, maybe sales over time, because that gives us a little bit more flexibility with what we actually include in the graph. And what would be in sales over time? Well, we want to take that same data frame that we had before, and I can print out that data frame real quick just so you can kind of see what it looks like. If I run this, we'll see the data frame pop up. It's got these products, quantity ordered of the product, the date that the product was ordered, a fake address. This is all mock data, a city, and kind of the longitude coordinates of that purchase. So it's just a bunch of purchases. And I think one recommendation, one little tip I have in Shinyland to kind of help you more easily manipulate your data frames quickly instead of having to print everything. Sometimes I like to go ahead and just honestly render a data frame within my dashboard. So that would look like render data frame, and we could call a function called sample sales data, and that's just going to return, how about the data frame that's in dat, And we'll just take, how about like the first 100 rows? We don't need much of this. Let's see if this works. We see we get our data frame. One little quality of life thing I may do here, just kind of separate this from everything else, is I might put this in a UI card. And all of this is in the documentation, and we'll detail it more in future videos. And I might give a UI header. It's kind of a nice little sneak preview of what you'll see in other videos. We'll call this sample data, sample sales data, and we'll let this re-render. So, I mean, it just really, all we did is just add this little card around our data. And we can see now we have our data frame here. And it's just kind of nice to see it in this view because we can kind of look a little bit more in depth. It's formatted nicely, but we see all of the different columns that we have in our data. Cool. All right, so what do we want to do with this sales over time? Well, basically, we want to group by the city and how about like the month? So we don't have a month right now. So that might be the first thing that we do. So I could do something like df. We also want to make sure that this is a date time object. So df order date equals df order date dot, oh, actually, it's I want to make this a date time object in pandas. So we're going to do pd dot to date time, and then we'll pass in all of this stuff. So this is just converting it to a nice date time object. That gives us some nice little items here, such as we can easily grab the month by doing something like df order date dot date, because now it's a date time object, dot month. And that would give us the numeric month, but let's say we wanted the month name. We can call this function that's built right into datetime objects in pandas. And now if we look at our data frame, we see we get the month here. So this leads me to kind of the first little thing that I wanted to mention on reactivity and Shiny, and that's this Reactive.Calc annotation. So basically what this allows us to do is when you're putting a lot of different visualizations on a screen, you oftentimes want to reuse pieces of code. Maybe you want to reuse variables, you want to reuse data frames, etc. But you don't want to have to like load those in each time that you need them. So this Reactive.Calc basically will run an operation, and then it will return a value, and then that value is cached so that whenever you call it, so we're calling it here and we're calling it here, it's going to take that cached value and easily retrieve it. You'll get it really very, very quickly. So it helps with efficiency here. But one thing that I'd kind of recommend is, I don't think it's great practice to directly modify that same data frame that is being called and created from the dat object. I kind of recommend that you either do everything in this dat function and then like everyone gets the updated data frame, or if you wanted to just modify a data frame for one function specifically, I'd recommend copying the data frame so that the render.plot1 up here wouldn't be affected by us adding a new month column to the data frame. That could cause problems in other situations. I don't think it would affect anything here, but it's just something to look out for, that this calculates a value, caches it, and then we use that same value in multiple places. And if we wanted to modify that data frame, let's do it with a copy instead of the original that other properties will see. And we'll get into this in more detail, but we also could pass in like inputs right in here. And when those inputs were updated, such as the number of items, you could also modify the data frame with a Reactive.Calc, and it would propagate the changes to anything that leverages that Reactive.Calc. At the end of this video, I'll link some extra resources where you can learn more about this stuff, but I wanted to kind of preview it now. Cool. So in this situation, I think honestly it is probably fine. I would think that it's kind of helpful for any potential function that I may have. It probably is helpful to have the order date as a date time object and the month column. So I'm gonna actually go ahead and move this into the Reactive.Calc. And we're gonna go ahead and return the data frame instead now. Perfect, but we'll see that this will update and we'll have the same as we had before. Cool. And now what would we want to render here? So we're ultimately doing sales over time. At this point, we don't need to modify anything, so I can just retrieve the value directly. And how might we get sales over time? Let's look at our data frame. We have the month, we have the city. How about we do a group by? So we'll call this sales equals df.group by. We're going to group by two different properties. We want to group by the city first, and then the month for that city. So it's kind of sales over time for each city. So we want to group by the city and the month. And then I think a good aggregation is the quantity ordered, same as we did for this plot 1 here. So we can do quantity ordered dot sum, and we can print out what that gives us. That we see we get something that looks like this. That looks pretty good, but honestly what I recommend is it doesn't have a name for the quantity ordered here, so we would want to also reset the index to just kind of make it a little bit easier to work with. And we'll see now we have that quantity ordered column back. And this is great. This is already super helpful. We could probably really just go ahead and plot this as a bar chart. So fig equals px.bar. We're going to do pretty similar to our last Plotly graph. Bar, sales, X will be the city in this, oh no, it will be the month in this case. And our Y will be the quantity ordered. Where is it? Where is it? Render that. Oh, I guess we didn't return this. So we want to go ahead and return the figure now. And look at that, we got 2 graphs now. And this is all of the cities. And so ultimately I think the splits in this is city by city. Unfortunately, it's not telling us that, but I think you could pass in a parameter into Plotly pretty easy and see which city all of these are for. But it doesn't matter too much for us because ultimately we want to do a filter on our data. Call this sales by city, which is ultimately the sales, and then only wanting to grab a city if it is equal to whatever city that we select. So how about as a very temporary placeholder, we take my hometown, Boston, Massachusetts, Boston, MA. And why is this yelling at me? Oh, we need equals equals. Alrighty. And that didn't work yet because we kept it still this. I want sales by city now. And look at that. Now this is just the sales in Boston. I don't know if you see this graph, but there's something weird that I'm seeing here that I don't love. And that's that it's not in order month-wise. So a quick little fix we could do for this is we could import a library called calendar. We could get the month orders by doing calendar.monthName. And then this is basically a helper function that lets you like index by the month number. So like month 1 gives us January. So if we wanted all of the months, we could do 1 through the end. I think 0 is just like an empty string in this case, but we have month orders, and then we can pass into this bar chart called like something category orders equals, and then this takes in a dictionary. I typically pass in a dictionary here. I might be able to take in other things. Basically, we want to set the month column that we use as our X value. We want to set that to have the order defined by month orders. And now if we see it, nice. January through December. Cool. So right now, honestly, we just plotted a graph, but let's now get into the reactivity here. I might isolate some things just to make it a little easier to see what I'm doing. I'm going to just temporarily comment out this. Okay, let's add another one of our components. So if we wanted to filter by specific cities and use city as our input, I think a good way to do that might be to do either select ties multiple or select single. I'm going to do the select ties multiple. We'll start with this. Go ahead and copy this code. It's often easy to just do that. And I will go ahead and pass in this code. All right, this first one is the name of the variable. So in this case, we'll do city. And I'll say for this, like select a city, how about? And now this is basically label and value. So in this case, I think it's fine if we use a list and just have our labels and values be the same exact thing. Maybe just to show you what I'm talking about here, I'll let this render real quick. So you see that like the value would be 1A, but the choice, the label for it is choice 1A. So if I grabbed and printed I'll just print it in here. If I printed input.city and we grab this input by doing, we always access variables with reactive components using this input keyword, and we imported this here from Shiny Express. Grab that and then basically just grab whatever we named it in our, when we defined our input method, our input component, and you just end it with parentheses. That's just kind of the format. So now if we print out this input city, save that, and just look at our terminal because I'm printing it. Oh, we haven't selected anything yet, but if I now do 1A, you see that it says choice 1A, but the actual value is just 1A. But we're fine for our case doing just a list of all the different cities that we have access to. So to figure that out, we might just print df.city.unique. That will give us a list. And actually, to make it even easier for us, we can get it specifically formatted as a list. Perfect. We can go ahead and just copy this and then paste it into our code. One little quality of a life improvement I recommend in coding land, this is just basically anything Python. Not a huge deal if you don't do this, but one thing that I like to do sometimes, go into our sales folder, and we have this app.py file. I'm going to save it real quick. Initial sales by city code. One thing that I like to do, just because like this is so long of a list, you could just kind of like manually format it, but a good way to standardize things is I use a code formatter called black. So for me, I can run black app.py and watch what happens to our code. It gets reformatted, and it just adheres to certain Python best practices, and I just think it oftentimes makes things look more clean. So I often will run that. So now we have our list of cities here, and if we run our app again, now we can select cities, Boston, how about Los Angeles, San Francisco. We want to filter our data by that. And I don't think anything changed. Did we see any updates? I did not see any updates. To make the updates a little bit more clear, I'll also temporarily hide this. I'm doing a command / I always forget my slash directions to comment everything at once. I highlight everything and then do command / Nice little trick. Okay, so yeah, we're not using the city at all. This is not changing anything. So now we need to go into our sales over time plot. We want to edit the code, and this is right now hard-coded to be Boston, Massachusetts. But now we have a list of items, so how about we do .isin, and we'll do input.city. All right, there's nothing there. Now we get Boston. Now, look at that. Now we have 3 cities. So it's a nice little filter here. That looks pretty good. It is working properly. There would be some way to label this, so I'm not going to go through it now because I want to focus on the reactivity. But you see that that works. I think one issue I had, though, with this is that it didn't start with the default value. So I'd also recommend passing in a default value. So because I am extremely biased, I'm going to use Boston, Massachusetts, my hometown, and also Posit HQ hometown. So multiple reasons why Boston is great. Is that default? Come on. I'm gonna have to go look at the documentation again. What is the default? Default. And so here we see in this input selectize, there's a selected. By default, it is none, but if we change that to be selected equals, let's say, Boston, Massachusetts, this should work for us. Hey, look at that. We see Boston by default, cool. But we could also add, Los Angeles, Seattle, cool. So that's one way to do it. We could just set this to be false, and then that would force us to have only one city. One issue I'm seeing here, though, is that now we would need to change this syntax. Instead of doing a list here, it would need to be, I'm going to set this to be equal input.city. And now let's see if this works. Cool, looks good. Make sure it's changing values. Yeah, it's definitely updating. One recommendation I might have is we want to kind of prove to ourselves what city is like being shown. One cool thing you could also do is you can pass in inputs in multiple spots within Shiny. So I could also, how about pass in a title to this and just do like sales over time dash dash, and then pass in using an F string syntax in Python, input.city. So you can pass in your input multiple places and rerun this. Did I make a mistake? What did I do? Oh, need a comma here. Should have automatically regenerated. Look at that. Sales over time Boston. If I switch this to Dallas, sales over time Dallas. Cool. And I think at this point we can put back our original chart. And we can re-add in our sample data. I'm going to open this up in a browser just so we can see everything. And it's doing something weird now where it's squeezing everything in super tightly. So that is because we currently have this fillable equals true set. So how about we set this to false and just kind of let it take whatever space it needs. And I also want to make sure I update the title to show that this is video 2 of 5, not first video. That looks better in our situation. So as we can see, we can update our cities, and we can also update the number of items in the total items in this sales data that were sold. One really important Shiny detail here with reactivity is this is one of the things that makes Shiny special, and oftentimes the framework you might want to use over other popular frameworks. And that is when I update the number of items, nothing is changing in this visualization down here. Only the chart that is affected by this input number of items in the code, this input numeric, is updated. And this is really important because imagine you had a visualization that takes like a minute to update and render. Well, what if you changed, anytime you updated one of these numbers, you had to reload the full application, which is how some frameworks work. Like it just would take forever. So it's super nice that inputs are defined in such a way that when you update something, only the components that use that input are re-rendered. If you want to learn more about this, I recommend checking out Gordon Shotwell's How Does Rendering Work in Python video. I'll link it in the description. That being said, in addition to having items that only affect one visualization, you could also have inputs that affect multiple visualizations at the same time. And the same principle applies. Only the visualizations, only the components that depend on an input will be updated and kind of re-rendered when you change that input value. So going back to our list of possible components, how about we use like a checkbox? Okay, very easy. Copy this code, paste it in. And how about this checkbox changes the color of our bar charts in our Plotly figures. So paste in our code, got the checkbox, and I'll just call this like bar color. And the label will be, how about we make it red? So make bars red, question. That'll be set to false initially. Input checkboxes, I think, either have a value of false or true. So if we wanted to make it like red or blue, we'd probably want to have a Reactive.Calc that just kind of reads this bar color and returns red or blue based on the truthiness of this. So I'm going to make another Reactive.Calc. I'm going to call this one just simple like color, and that will return, how about red if input.bar color. So if this is true, then we're going to return red, else return else return blue. Oh, oops, else blue. This is a nice little shorthand syntax to do that. And then in our figure, what we would want to do, and we'll start with the sales over time, is we would want to do fig.update traces, and we'd want to pass in marker color equals color. Okay, so we see that this is now a different blue. If we go ahead, make bars red, it is now red, and we can do the same thing for our first plot. So I'm going to move this into a variable. Same thing, update traces, marker color equals color, and then we return fig. Okay, both blue, and I click this, make bars red. We see that they both re-render, and to make it a little easier to see, I'll make this full screen. They're both red, both blue, both red, both blue. If I update this, only this top chart is changing. If I update this, only the bottom is changing. And then if I click this, both change at the same time. So it smartly renders things based on how the inputs are used. And honestly, like, this information here is enough to kind of get off the ground running. When you start building more and more complex applications in Shiny, this same principle applies. And you can kind of follow it kind of one visualization piece at a time, just kind of focus on one piece. If you want to learn a little bit more about kind of some of the complexities and how to think about this, I recommend checking out Posit CTO Joe Cheng's video on Shiny programming best practices. I'll link that also in the description. All right, with that, I'm going to commit the code. I'm going to push it to GitHub, so the link will be also in the description to this finished code. And then I also will push this and deploy it so that you can actually access this app easily in the cloud. And I'll do that by doing the following command. And this was shown in the first video if you didn't see this, if you want to be able to do something like this. And I did a command or Control R to find my recent commands. Just a nice little shortcut. You do Control R and start typing, or let me just try this one more time. Control R and then start typing in the command that you know you want to use. And ultimately, it will autocomplete things. And if you keep clicking Control R, it will keep searching through, recursively searching through functions you've used recently. So that's a helpful terminal trick. So this will be sales video 2. I'm going to deploy that. Oh no, we got to get into sales. Deploy that. And I will speed this up so you can see the final thing deployed. Awesome, and we see now we have this URL, sales video 2, so you can access this link and play around with the app right there. All right, so now that we've learned this, the basics of reactivity, what is next? Well, you can keep building on your knowledge of reactivity. There's some really cool stuff that I didn't show here in this video. So first 2 resources I recommend are Gordon Shotwell's How Does Shiny Render Things and Joe Cheng's Shiny Programming Practices. These have a lot of additional kind of info, and they're true experts, building Shiny. So they have a lot of great input and advice regarding best practices. But the second recommendation that I would make is to go to the documentation and explore reactivity there. So again, for Shiny Express that we're using in this video, you can go to this URL. Also, we'll link it in the description. And you can check out some of the specific components for reactivity. So look up reactive programming, cool. So we touched on Reactive.Calc. We didn't touch on Reactive.Effect, but let me click on that real quick. And Reactive.Effect is basically a Reactive.Calc, but but there's no return. So Reactive.Calc has a return, Reactive.Effect, same thing, no return though. So we can see examples if we scroll down here. Other things that I would say are important here that you should check out is, how about a Reactive.Event? So imagine that you didn't want something to automatically update. You only wanted it to re-render if a certain event was true. You could use a Reactive.Event for that case. And I always learn the best by going to the examples down at the bottom. This one's a little bit more complex, but it basically, we have some functions here. And so that this first one has a reactive event that is triggered on input.buttonOut. We have another reactive effect that is triggered on, button.Calc. And we have a third reactive event that is triggered on input.buttonEffect. And so what we'll basically see is that we have, if we go down to what it's outputting, we have this value that is updating like every 0.5 seconds. But these functions we saw are only triggered when we click on a specific button. So this first one, input.buttonOut, only will this be called, this string value.get, when I click button out. So button out is defined by an input action button here, the one update number. So watch what happens when I click this. It updates to 980. So it's gonna be whatever value we see ticking over here, 785. Cool. This next one, button calc, will only be updated. It'll be 1 over the value.get when I call this. This third one will only be triggered when I click button.effect. And one thing that's cool though is like, you can kind of edit these examples in real time. So what if I wanted to make them all dependent on the first button click? Button out, button out. So now what we'll see is if I rerun this by clicking the top right, rerun app, and we go down. When I click this, all 3 of these will update because they're all triggered on the first button. Look at that. Cool. So that's Reactive.Event. And look at the documentation. Final one, Reactive.Isolate is nice. If you don't want something to be affected by kind of a recalculation, you only want it to happen on certain situations. So in this case, if I change the slider, the histogram down here is not updated, but if I click go, then it is updated. So that's kind of what this Reactive.Isolate is doing. You could read all about it in the description. I do want to mention invalidate later. I think this is pretty cool. Imagine you had some sort of app that was running in real time, and every like 1 second it had to collect some new data, and I wanted a display of the a real-time stream of the values of this data. Invalidate later is super helpful for this. It basically tells this render.text function in this situation, in this example, that every 0.5 seconds, this function should be invalidated and you should recalculate a new value for it. And that's why we're seeing these numbers change. So if you need to do something time and time again at a set frequency, look at using this reactive invalidate later. A lot of useful stuff in the docs. The docs are always great. Read the docs. It can definitely help take your skills with reactive components to the next level. But I think that we kind of did the basics. We looked at where we can learn about more advanced things. I think that's a good stopping point for this video. This course is brought to you by Posit Connect. When working in a company, a startup, a big organization, one of the biggest challenges is you write all this code, you have a cool looking application, and then it's how do I share this with my team? How do I share this with external and internal stakeholders? And Posit products such as Posit Connect make this easy for you. They allow you to quickly deploy your applications. They allow you to automatically have these applications update and refresh as new data comes in. They allow you to securely share pieces of your product with only select members of your team. And this is not just limited to Shiny for Python. This is available to all Python applications that you might want to use: Streamlit, Dash, Fast API, Flask, etc. You don't need to become a web developer. Your team doesn't need to hire an extra data engineer. Connect helps you focus on the data project first, and then it handles all of those challenging things through the platform. Make deployment the easiest step in your analytics workflows and try out Posit Connect today. You can try out Posit Connect for free for 3 months by checking out the link at the top of the description. All right, let's get back to the course. Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to learn how we can make our dashboards in Shiny look a lot more professional, and that's using layouts. So as a reminder, basically in this video series, we're working our way up to build a dashboard that looks like this. And in the last video of the series, we kind of had a dashboard that looked like this. We focused on reactivity and making these toggle inputs that could dynamically affect our graph. So we're going to build off of that in this video, and we're specifically going to look at how we can start structuring things more professionally using cards, using sidebars, using all these different layout components that are available via Shiny. Makes a big difference when you start using these components to make your dashboards just look much better. We're not going to completely finish our app today, but we'll have templated components that we can fill in the videos 4 and 5. To get started with the code, you can go to the GitHub repo that is associated with this project, and all the different parts are listed here in the README, and you can find the finished source code from each part, so feel free to jump in at any point, but we'll be working off of the part 2 code, so you can go here to access that, all linked in the description. When thinking about how to format your dashboards and applications professionally, I like to start at the Shiny for Python homepage. And I think probably the quickest way to get a nice looking dashboard or application is by going into components and going to templates. So here you'll see a bunch of different starter apps that if you have a specific goal in mind, these are probably pretty good to kind of take the exact source code and kind of run with them and fill in your own graphs and charts and information as needed. So for example, maybe I wanted to just take this basic dashboard. I can click on it. I can copy this terminal command. I can go over to Visual Studio Code, and I could do something like paste in this command and go ahead and run that. We see now we have this dashboard app in the folder that we're working off of. And if I run the app.py there, open up the specific file in there, we're in the dashboard folder. First step we'll need to do is install the requirements from that template. So we can do pip install requirements.txt, and it even suggests that right here, as we can see. And now we should see this FA icons is installed properly. That was the only, I think, library that we didn't have. And we can go ahead now and run this app. And we see we have that dashboard that was in the templates. So if I was working on my own, I might take a dashboard like this and fill in the information specific to the data set that I need, but it gets me started and have something to work off of super quickly. So really suggest templates as a good starting point, and there's a bunch to choose from. But let's say we had something completely custom in mind. What would we do in that situation? So kind of thinking back to our code from the last video, we had some graphs already started, and maybe we want to put that in a specific way that there isn't really a good starter template for us to use. Well, in that situation, and I'm going to go back to the code real quick so we can see what we're working off of. Hide this dashboard real quick, and we're going to go into our sales folder, go into the app there, and we're going to run this app. So we have this dashboard over here. So how could we make this look just a little bit more professional and customize the layout, everything? Well, for that purpose, I would go into components and I would go into layouts. And in this layouts, we see kind of a cheat sheet of the different options that we have with layouts. One of the things that I would really start with is cards. So we can see we have a bunch of different card options as we look through this. So like sidebar within a card, even just contents in cards. And for me, when I think of cards, I kind of just think that it isolates the different pieces of our application and just makes it cleaner, easier to look at. So I like kind of to start with putting things in cards. What would that look like in our code? Well, as we can see with this dashboard that we have currently, it's all just kind of scattered along. So I think that we should group things that are similar into their own cards. So like the number of items here should be in the same card as the graph here. Same thing with the city here should be in the same card as the data and visualization here. And we can actually already see that our data frame already has a card around it, so that's nice. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, how do we do that? Well, we can click on Content and Cards. We can see that there's some example code right here, and it's actually using columns too, and we'll kind of get into columns in a little bit. But if I just use this with UI.card, we can start adding things directly to that. So we see that there's also a card header property. You could add text to your cards, and we see that here and here. So it's good to always look through the documentation on these cards. So I'm going to copy the with UI.card, and I'm going to put our number of items and this graph into one card. So we could do that by doing with UI, and we imported UI from up here, from Shiny Express, .card. I want to render that plotly, so I'm going to nest that in here. And I'm also going to put the input control, the number of items here. We'll put that in the card as well. So we need to delete it from here. Okay, rerun this. And now we see it's nicely in its own card and it's a bit more isolated from everything else. So we should do the same thing for the select a city option. So again, you can just copy the same thing with UI.card, nest this in. And I'm highlighting it all and then doing tab to indent it and nest this in. And now we have another card, nice. So that looks pretty good. All right, what else do we want to do here? Well, I think first off, I want to change this to video 3 just so we know what we're talking about here. Okay, what next? Well, if I'm going to make this look a little bit more professional, I think I might just kind of get rid of this make bars red. I feel like this is kind of weird to have just sitting in here. So I might just remove that quick as we start formatting things more. We'll play around with the style and the colors in the 5th video in the series, the final part. And in that, you'll see all these different ways that you can really customize the various different graphs and styles that you use within your Shiny application. But if I was to remove this, we would also need to remove things that depend on this input. So if you remember, we had this update traces in both of our charts that leverages that. So if I just delete this, delete this, delete this, and delete this, then we've removed all of our color dependencies. You can keep it in if you want, but I'm just going to kind of simplify things a bit. The color does change a bit, but I'm fine with that. We can see that things still update properly. All right, well, we're ultimately working towards a dashboard in this video that kind of looks like this. So we want to move up our city to the top. We want to move this down and have another column here for a heat map. And we want to have a card that's kind of listed out here that we can start playing around with. And we also have these toggle options. Okay, so how can we start doing that? Well, let's go back to our components and see what different layouts that we have access to. And we see like sidebar, collapse sidebar, navbar at top, navbar at bottom. So looking at our final dashboard that we're working towards in this video, we have a card header and a sidebar in the first card. So let's try to make this happen using the components we see in the documentation. So we have sidebarred within a card. Maybe this would be helpful for us. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this, go into our code, and paste that in. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so what we wanted to have is have our input within the sidebar. So I'm going to paste this in the sidebar. Make sure it's nested properly. That looks good. We want to have our chart in the content area. So I'm going to paste it with the same level of nesting that the little preview text had. Save that. I guess it's running into an error maybe because I had an extra floating UI card. Save that. We see now we have the chart within the sidebar. And I realized I actually put the wrong chart. I wanted the other chart in there. So I'm going to quickly undo things and actually paste in This UI input select ties into the sidebar area. Nest that in. Now we see we have the city in there and the card content still floating here. So I need that now to post in this render.plot function into the card content area. And I like the text can be used for placeholders because it just makes it a little bit, I feel like, easier to know where you should put things. And you can always use the text as a placeholder if you haven't finished all your graphs yet. Cool, that looks good. We're running into an issue with our render.plot, and that's because we actually accidentally deleted our input. So I just need to quickly paste that input back into this card. All right, that looks pretty good. I can extend this to kind of see it. Already we're doing pretty well. I'm going to just run this from scratch again real quick. Cool, that looks good. One thing that it's worth mentioning real quick with like these sidebars is you always can go into your sidebar, into your function. If you have a platform like Visual Studio Code, it'll show you some of your arguments that you can use. One that I sometimes like to use with sidebars is make sure that by default it's open. If we look at this, if I change this to false, when we render this, it will start closed. So I'll just rerun this real quick so you can see. Oops, it looks like we have an error. It's not open equals true or false, it's the actual text. So I can say it starts as closed, for example. And we see that we only see like Boston. And I don't like it starting as closed because I feel like it's not clear that you could even do this that way. So like I would want to ensure that it is open to start. And so you can do that. Make sure you enforce that with this. It's good to know these keyword arguments. All right, now we have this. Well, if we look at our kind of final chart, we see we also have a header here. So you can add that very easily by doing, oh, I guess we already have a header. We can just change this to sales by city 2023. Cool. Now let's see what else is different in the chart that we're doing. And kind of how I would think about this if I was to do this from scratch. I know we're kind of working off a template here, but I feel like you could like use even a piece of paper and kind of sketch out what charts, what visualizations you want there. And then kind of how I'd approach it is I'd probably stub out what that looks like with cards and stuff and just have pieces of text, as we can see like a piece of text here with the heat map here. And then when I'm actually filling in my graphs and stuff, start putting those pieces in. That's how I like to kind of think about styling and all of that. I like to kind of have my placeholders first, and then it's just a matter of filling in the graphs. But everyone kind of has their own personal preferences here. Okay, so but we see that this has different tab options, which I think is a pretty cool feature. And we also have this number of items control here that adjusts and plays around with all of them. So let's start working towards this. What does this look like? Well, going back to our documentation, shiny.posit.code/py/layouts, we scroll down. We see that we have all of these different tab options. Maybe we want to take a card with pill tab set, for example. And I can go ahead and copy some of this code, copy it, and we're ultimately going to do it in the second area where we currently have this card. So if I just added this as is, what would it look like? We see we have that all working, so it's nice to test how that works. That looks pretty good. And what we could very easily do is we could just paste in our graph code and nest that within one of these tabs. So now we see we do have this graph right there, and we kind of have placeholders for the other pieces of that. And if you have a keen eye, you notice that The one that we're actually working towards with this template is this underline nav set. So there's just different styles of tabs. Everyone can have their own personal preference. I kind of like this underline style. I think there's something clean about it. We're gonna use that for our tabs. So really, there's only a small change we need to make. Right now we have this nav set card pill, but if we look at the documentation, on these relevant functions, we see that there's also this nav set card tab, or actually, wait, I'm looking for underline. So I don't actually see it here in the layouts, but doing a little bit more digging inside of the full documentation, we see that one of the options we have is nav set underline. So I'm gonna go ahead and use this nav set underline. Save that. I think I have to do nav set card underline. Cool, look at that. So we now have that all working. And nav set card underline. And we can customize what it says in these by changing up the text in the UI.nav panel. The nav panel is kind of the nested element under all of these high-level tab options. So we could do like top sellers here, and we see that that changes. The other options in our dashboard are top sellers value, lowest sellers, and lowest sellers values. So I might as well fill those in now. And we see that there's this other links option. I might get rid of that menu and just use the nav panels for each one. Top sellers value, lowest sellers, and lowest sellers value. Look at that. We see we have everything at least stubbed out there. I think before we fill in the different details here, I think we should real quick switch gears and just also understand how we can have this split the screen. So if we wanted it to split the screen with cards, how can we go about doing that? Going into our layouts, one of the things that you'll see if you scroll around here is columns, grid layouts, etc. So all these arrange element features. So I think the things that you'll probably use the most are layout columns and layout columns wrap. One thing that I particularly like about the documentation is that if you scroll down just a little bit, there's a nice little how-to guide on when to use layout columns and when to use layout columns wrap. If you want your cards like the same size and height, same width and height, and kind of a regular cadence, it makes sense to use layout column wrap. If you want to customize the layout column widths and have different sizes at different points, it makes sense to use layout columns. So I think we want to use layout columns wrap for our use case, but I'm going to just quickly show layout columns just so you have an idea of how it works. So if I did a with UI.layout columns here, I can put all of my cards underneath this. So I could add some placeholder cards, UI.cards, card, placeholder. Is placeholder one word or two? I think it's one word. With UI.card, placeholder. So there's going to be some default options that it does by default. And you see it kind of just splits it evenly by default. But we can kind of customize it. So I could specify column widths here. And let's say I wanted my first column to take up most of the room. I could say 8, 2, 2 here. And I'll break down these numbers 8, 2, 2 in a second. But we see that, yeah, that takes up 2/3 of the space, and then placeholder and placeholder take up 1/6 respectively. If I customize this to be like, same ratio, 4:1:1, you might think that it will do the same exact thing, but we see that it actually squeezes it in. So this is not just ratios. This is actually based off of a 12-column grid. So if you want to fill the full screen, you got to use all 12 of those columns. And that's all specified here in the documentation. If you look at column widths, it's all based on 12-column grid. So that's one good thing to know that's not immediately maybe clear, that you might not intuitively know, but it's just good to kind of dig into the documentation and understand that. There's a bunch of different options if you want it to change size based on how big or small your screen space is. There's options to do that. A bunch of different options with layout columns on how you might specify things and tweak the layout. And you could just keep adding cards here. I could add another card. And we see it fills in some space, and that could also be specified. Maybe I wanted that to fill up the rest of the space. I could do a 6 here, and we see that it fills in the rest of the space here. But everything's getting a little bit too squeezed, so I think maybe it makes sense to just have things, just 2 cards here. So I'm going to remove these 2. Probably going to get an error right now because it doesn't know what to do. Oh, I guess it's fine. It just uses the first 2 elements here. But I might want it to just be half and half of the screen, so I could specify that with 6 and 6. And we see we get a nice even split. A similar way to do that would be to use the layout columns wrap and specify widths equals 1/2. And we'll see that we get the same. Oh, if I could properly use parentheses, right? We'll see that when I save this, layout column wrap, not layout columns wrap. Layout column wrap. We see we get the same type of deal. So that's a little bit about columns. And it's worth mentioning, if I now, with the layout columns wrap, add more cards, and save this, because it knows to specify, because it knows that this should be 1/2 of the screen, it should have placed just 1 or 2 items on a single row. But I realized if I look at the documentation real quick, I accidentally made a small mistake where it's not widths, it's width here. So I always double check the documentation, and I could do width equals 1/2. And we'll see now it nicely puts it into a grid where each item takes up half of the available screen real estate, and it will dynamically adjust based on how much real estate there is. If I did make this, let's say 1/3, then they're evenly going to take up 1/3 of the screen, and then the 4th item in that column wrap will go to the next row. So this makes it easy to do grids and all of that. You can also set fixed widths. If you want something to be a specific, pixel size, go into fixed width. You can see that we can do that. So maybe I wanted my first element or all of my elements to be, 300, 500 pixels, let's say. Delete this. Width equals 1/3. We'll see how this updates things. Oh, oops. This is just a Boolean. So I actually need to specify. This is why we read the documentation. So I would need to do width. If I did width equals 1000 pixels, you see it does one thing. If I do fixed width equals true, then it's going to actually do that 1000 and not dynamically adjust. It's going to not do the same type of dynamic adjusting it would if it wasn't fixed width equals true. You can play around with all these parameters. There's a lot of customization. I think oftentimes it's trickier to get into these fixed width scenarios. I usually think it's better practice to just let things dynamically fill the space based on how much screen real estate you have. So I kind of like, doing this width equals 1/2 type approach. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Cool. And so if we look at our chart, our final kind of what we're working towards, we see we have a heat map here, and then we have this like US map of sales down here that takes up the full space. So how can we fill in these details? Well, I don't need these extra nav panel, or I don't need the extra cards down here. I could do a card that is the sales by location data or map here. And note that this is outside of our layout column wrap. So as we see, it fills up the whole space. It doesn't fill up half of the row because it's outside of that column wrap item. I might even do a UI.card header here and put the sales location map in that so it's a little bit cleaner. So you got that. Nice little placeholder for that. This placeholder was a heat map. So I could even also add a card header here. And this is basically going to be sales by time. So sales by time of day heat map, I might say here is the header. And we can fill that in videos 4 and 5. And then finally, I think the last thing we really want to do in this video specifically is how can we customize these tabs to actually show the different content? Well, we can basically copy this plot and paste it into the other areas. Okay, so let's start with one. We're going to have to name this differently. So I'm going to say plot 2 to start. And we see that we have an issue. So duplicate input output IDs found, and it's yelling because we have this input numeric in both the first nav panel and the second nav panel. So that's an issue. So I could go ahead and delete this from the second one. And now we see we have a chart that looks like this. I go to top sellers value, and it's not there, but I can adjust things. And if I go to this other panel, we do see that it also adjusts there. So that's good to know. But it's not really ideal because I think it's a little clunky to have only the input available in one of the tabs and not the others. So how do we solve this? How do we get this input available in all of them? There's a nice little keyword argument that we can pass in this input numeric into. So I copied that. And if you look at the navset card underline options, do a comma and see the kind of what we can fill in. One of the things you'll see here is this footer option. So you could either do header or footer, but this is very convenient because we can pass in like inputs and whatnot into this footer and have it propagate for all the nav panels within the navset card underline. So this can all be seen in the documentation. I like to kind of view what keyword arguments I have available to me via like Visual Studio Code and that, but I'm going to paste in that input numeric. And now look what we have. So we have the top sellers value. That number of items is there for both of them. So that's pretty nice. Let's give these more descriptive names. So this is like, how about plot top sellers? This will be plot top sellers value. And what is the difference between top sellers and top sellers value? So top sellers is based on purely the quantity ordered, whereas top sellers value, in my eyes, is there's these columns quantity ordered and price each. So it's going to be equal to the quantity ordered times the price each. So I could add a new column here. And remember, we don't want to directly modify a Reactive.Calc value. So we see that this data frame is part of a Reactive.Calc because this value is ultimately cached. And if we modify the value, it just all sorts of weird stuff happens. So we either need to copy this data frame from the cached value and then modify the copied data frame. So I could do something like value equals df quantity ordered times df price each. That would work. And then we could modify this chart to use the value instead. That's one approach. I think honestly though, it's probably helpful for all of our graphs to have access to this value column. So I'm going to go ahead and actually modify the Reactive.Calc to include this. So df value equals df quantity ordered times df price each. And if I rerun this, we'll now see that we have a value column here. And then we can use this value column in our top seller's value chart. Switch this y input to value. Switch the group by to value. And now if we look at our top sellers, we see that AAA batteries sold the most quantity, but value-wise, a MacBook Pro laptop made the most value, which makes sense. Batteries are cheap. You're going to sell a lot of these cheap batteries. We might not sell as many MacBook Pros, but each MacBook Pro is $1,000+. So it makes sense that the top seller's value amount is greater for MacBook Pros. We can repeat this process with our other charts. So lowest sellers, what would that look like? Plot lowest sellers. And all we need to change here is that there's this n largest here. That's the largest quantity ordered. We can change this to the built-in pandas n smallest to make this lowest sellers. And then we can copy the top seller's value from here, paste it in lowest seller's value. And again, this should be n smallest here. And this is plot lowest seller's value. Now if we look at this, we have options for each. I can dynamically adjust this. We see that we have all of those filled in with this nice little footer. We have some other cards that are ready to be filled in. We have the sidebar. So we've now shown how we can do a bunch of different customizations to our layout and start really getting something that's more professional, something we're more proud to publish by leveraging these layout components. And we'll continue building off of this in videos 4 and 5, but this is kind of a good starting point. Having this separarization in your visualizations just makes it much easier to read and follow a dashboard like this. All resources mentioned in this video can be found in the description. And again, just as a reminder, we're ultimately working our way towards an app that looks like this. And so in videos 4 and 5, we'll see how we can start adding these different additional visualizations to our chart. And then in video 5, we'll see how we can customize the colors and add a nice fancy title like this to really make this dashboard your own. Hopefully you enjoyed this video on layouts in Shiny. If you did enjoy it, make sure to throw this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, everyone, peace. Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to see how we can combine Matplotlib, Plotly, Seaborn, and all of your other favorite Python visualization libraries into a Shiny for Python app. One of the things that I love about Shiny is that, you have this capability. I feel like so many times in the past, I've done some analysis in Python and then been working for a client, working for a company that requires me to port that into something very specific, not using Python. Whereas if I had Shiny for Python, 5 years ago, I could have easily just spun up a dashboard using all of the same visualizations. As a reminder, in the last video in this series, we built a dashboard that looked like this with some placeholders where we can put different Python visualizations. In this video, we're going to fill in those placeholders with like a heat map, another type of heat map of the actual US, and then change this top graph to use Altair instead of Plotly. And throughout this process, we'll learn about all the different kind of annotations and how you can incorporate many more libraries than just what we cover in this video. And then finally, we're ultimately working towards a dashboard that looks like this by the end of the series. I think the only thing we might not cover in this video is really the styling and the coloring and some of these final tweaks. So we might not have all of these colors set by the end of this video, but we'll have all the graphs and we'll leave all of the styling details for video 5. Should be a lot of fun. So to get started with the code, I recommend going to this GitHub URL. I'll link it in the description. And depending on what part you want to jump in on, you can scroll down and see the different parts of the series. We're going to be building off of the source code for part 3 in this video. So you can go ahead and look at the code right here. Or if you want to specifically have all of this code locally, what you could do is you could fork the repo so that you have your own personal copy of it. Once it's forked in your personal copy, you're going to click code. You're going to copy this URL, open up the terminal window, and you're going to want to do git clone and paste in that link. You're going to navigate into that folder, and then you want to get all the branches in that repo. So you're going to do git fetch origin, and then finally you can do git checkout video 3. And it will switch to the branch that has all of the code from video number 3. You want to navigate into the sales folder. You might need to install, if we look in that folder, there's requirements.txt. You might need to install the requirements.txt by doing pip3 install -r requirements.txt. And then the final step that you might want to do, if you use VS Code, you might have access to this code period to just directly open that from your terminal. And we see we have our app.py right here, and I can click run, and the dashboard loads right there, and we can start working on this code. You might even create another branch that's separate from this code, however you want to approach it, but that's my general recommendation. First, we'll quickly want to change this to video 4 of 5. But after that, I would say a good starting point would be to really understand how to render Matplotlib visualizations using Shiny. And the kind of keyword for that is this render.plot function. So how about we start down here with the heat map? And we'll start by just doing a simple Matplotlib plot, but then we'll make a heat map using Seaborn. And ultimately, there's a lot of Python graphic libraries that are all based off of Matplotlib. So even though this render.plot really focuses on Matplotlib, it covers so many different libraries in Python because so many are based off of Matplotlib. So we can go down here to this heat map and we could start plotting a chart down there using Matplotlib. So to do that, we'd want to add a render.plot annotation here. We want to pass in a function, so I'll call this plot sales by time, how about? And then in that, we'll pass in our Matplotlib code. So as a reminder, if you're using Matplotlib, you can import it by doing import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. That's typically how you'll see it. Down here, we could immediately plot something with Matplotlib by doing like plot dot, how about bar chart? We could pass in some random numbers for our x, pass in some random numbers for our y, and that will actually work right there. As you can see, we have a little chart, but let's make this actually use our data. So as a reminder, we're using sales data. We have a bunch of different products, how many times they were ordered, the price of the order, and when they were ordered. So this is like a Unix timestamp. But ultimately, we can convert that to a date time object and get more easy like months and hours from it. So if we want to do sales by time, and I'm thinking of time of day, so what hour from 0 to 24 were these purchases made? Well, to do that, we might want to add another column. So we're accessing our data frame using this DAT Reactive.Calc. That's over here at the top of our code, found right here. I'm going to add another column to that. I'm just going to call this hour. And hour is going to be equal to df order date, our date time object, .dt.hour. We can easily access a numeric integer hour from that. If we go down to our data frame, scroll to the right, we see we have an hour now. 14, 20, 18, that all makes sense. I think the max actually is going to be 23. So if you wanted to like offset this by 1, you could, but I think it actually makes sense starting at 0, going to 23, because ultimately once you get to 24, it turns to the next day. So we don't actually want to see 24 here in our data. And then we could access a simple bar chart by doing something like sales by time or sales by hour, how about, equals df.value count, or df, how about hour, and then grab the value counts of that. If we printed sales by hour and rerun this, or actually just open our terminal, we get something that looks like this, that has the hour and then the count. The last step to make this a little bit easier for us, I would recommend doing a reset index, and then watch what it prints out. Now it prints out a nice data frame with hour and count. So we could easily pass in a x equals sales by hour, and then a y, which would equal, or I guess they use height now these days, but I think if you pass in y, it's fine too. Sales by hour count. What does that give us? I guess it likes the height now. We get something that looks like this, and you could pass in like your x ticks and different Matplotlib keyword arguments. So our x ticks might be like numpy. Do we have numpy imported? I guess we don't, so I'm going to import that as well. You could do something like np.arange 0 to 24. I think that would give us the right amount of ticks. Is there no x ticks keyword argument? When in doubt, Google search, or actually, you could use Copilot. Add tick marks from 0 to 23 to my Matplotlib chart. Except, so it looks like I have to do it separately. That's weird. Run this. I didn't save it, oops. Cool, so that gives us all of the tick marks that we need. That's a simple Matplotlib chart. You could obviously customize this as you need. It knows to output that plot object, but you could also return a figure here and it still would work. But we actually want a heat map using Seaborn. So we can also do that within this render.plot function. If you go to Seaborn, the documentation, you'll see that it's a Python data visualization library based on Matplotlib. And there's a lot of other Matplotlib-based or Matplotlib adjacent libraries that we can use. Some immediately that I know about are like Plot9. You can use pandas directly. There's a lot of pandas.plot functionality that you can immediately tap into. So I could do something like, let's see what would make sense to do. Sales by hour dot plot. And then I could pass in the column names, hour, x equals hour, y equals count, and watch this. It didn't do exactly what I wanted it to do, but you can see that it does have plotting ability. I think I need to specify that this is a bar chart. Kind equals bar. So we see we get a bar chart now. And in this situation, it looks like it sorted it from greatest to smallest, but I would really want it to be in order of 0 to 24. So you might be able to, you can specify these things, you can change this around, but pandas also works. You can use libraries like HoloViews, XArray, GeoPandas, a lot of Matplotlib-based plotting you can do. I'm gonna delete this real quick, just wanted to show that as an example. But what would it look like to do a Seaborn heat map like we have in ultimately the final plot that we're working towards? To do that, go to the Seaborn documentation, maybe look at API, look at somewhere in here, probably have a heat map, and look at how it's done. We have a pretty simple heat map that we want to deal with. We want to just have basically a 1D array, but I think that only takes in 2D, so we kind of have to play around with it a little bit. So I'm going to also import Seaborn. And we can change our chart to do something like, probably want to keep the sales by hour. We look at our docs. Basically takes in that 2D array. So we just need to format our values to be this 2D shape. We could do that in here by switching this up a little bit. So instead of resetting index, I'm going to actually re-index it. I'm going to pass in that numpy a range 0 to 24. Basically set this and sort it to be between 0 and 24, but use that as the index. So no longer is like our own separate column. We have that. We also, as like good practice with re-index, you should probably have a fill value. So if ever you don't have one of those numbers, we want to have that still show up in the heat map. So it would just be 0. In this situation, we're counting a lot of product sales, so we should always have greater than 0 value, but this is just good practice to do. What else do we need to do here? I think ultimately we might get errors if we try to do the heat map by just passing this sales by hour. I think it expects, it might take a data frame. Let's see. Pass the fill value into the wrong spot. Very close. I think we're going to have to reshape this. Reshape. We want it one column, and then however many rows we need, which would be like 24. So I probably could reshape this as 24 to 1. It should work. I guess we got to do sales by hour dot values dot reshape to turn it into numpy, and then numpy accepts heat map data. Let's see what happens there. Nice. That's our sales by hour. I don't love these colors, and I would love, I'm trying to think of other things. If we look at our final visualization, we have like the numbers right inside of the heat map, and I think that looks kind of good. So I'll pass in some parameters to this to give it more of that look. So annotation equals true. And honestly, there's a few different ways you can look into the documentation to see these different options. You can also honestly use like a large language model like ChatGPT or something to help you get it exactly how you want it. So a little bit of combo of this is how I figured out how to kind of get parameters how I wanted. Didn't need any X-tick labels. 0 there is kind of unnecessary. Y-tick labels. It's kind of nice to have more of an hour look. So you could do a list comprehension here, which you just do something like I:00 for I in range 24. And I think that's probably some good parameters. Run this. What does the updated graph look like? Oh, need some commas. Do I have commas everywhere? Oh, wow, that's looking a lot more like it. I think the only other thing we would want to add is some labels. And you can actually use the same Matplotlib labels to fix this. So plot.title might be something like number of orders by hour of day. The X label will probably be hour of day. And the Y label would just be order count. Like that. Got a nice heat map there. Perfect. That looks good. And you see all of this, it knows to render the plot properly. And as we see, we're editing some Matplotlib things, but we ultimately use Seaborn, and we get that chart there. So you have access to all of Seaborn, and you'll use the render.plot for that. Now, what are our other options here? So the other big category of things that we might plot with Shiny are IPython widgets. So if you go to this documentation page, I'll link it in the description, we can see that there's all sorts of ways to plot Jupyter widgets within Shiny. So some that show up right out of the box here are Altair, Bokeh, Plotly, Pydeck, etc. And what you'll see if you read into this documentation is they all kind of are under this subcategory render widget, but kind of give some fancy special things for specific libraries that Posit has specifically built support for, like Altair, Bokeh, Plotly, and Pydeck. You'll see that instead of using the render widget annotation for some of these, you can directly use a annotation that's specific to that library, like render.plotly here. So to do that, we need to import render.plotly from Shinylive widgets, and then we can kind of leverage plotly as we expect. And we've already actually seen this in our code. So if I go back to our VS Code, we see that we have render.plotly already being accessed here. So you can kind of keep that as is. But let's say instead of using plotly here for this first graph, so we'll see this first graph if I make it a little bit bigger, how about we switch that to use render Altair, so the Altair Python library. How would we change it to allow us to do that? Well, the first thing we would need to do is also import render Altair. That's the first step. We might also just import render widget if there's other extra cases that we want to deal with here. Okay, and now how do we convert plotly to render Altair? Honestly, what I might try is seeing what our good old friend ChatGPT or whatever your LLM of choice recommends for this. So I might type in convert this plotly code into Altair in Python. Okay, and I'm curious if I just copied this code and I pasted it in here, we're going to have success. Well, we're not going to have success immediately because we're not even importing Altair. So import Altair as ALT. Then it is saying sales over time, Altair, missing 2 positional. Oh, this is not necessary to pass in because we already know it. I guess we would have to grab df equals dat. Then our city is input.city. It's kind of confused by the shiny stuff. What does this look like now? City is not defined. What are you talking about? Input.city. Come on, does this work? Look at that. We already got a nice looking Altair chart. Oh, this is render plotly. It actually works just fine. It's just the type of thing is if in the future something changes and this needs to be very custom for plotly, you might run into errors here, so you'd want to actually use the annotation render Altair. So if there's a specific annotation for the library that you're using, go ahead and use it. But if you don't see one for your IPython widget, just use render widget, and that will kind of work for most situations that you need. We can see that if we change this, it does update. We kind of get good results overall. That's pretty cool to see. So other than Altair, plotly, Bokeh, Pydeck, what other options do you have with IPython widgets? Well, this is a list of different visualization Jupyter widgets that are available. So if you see any of these that you particularly like, you're probably in a good spot to use the render widget function. I don't know if these have all been tested with Shiny, but I think that this is something to explore a bit further. I'll link the list of these Jupyter or these Python widgets in the description. But also know that if you go into other, you'll see that this is actually also linked in the documentation. One other one what's worth mentioning is like IPyLeaflet. I think it's pretty cool to see. So we can see like a map like this is rendered via the render widget annotation. All right, what else? All right, we've done 2 of the changes. We got our heat map and we got our Altair chart here. I think the last thing we want to do is maybe do a sales by location heat map. And the IPyLeaflet is one way to approach this. I feel like for heat maps, one library that I have particularly liked is the Folium library. So I think it's worth discussing the Folium library a bit. So our code for this placeholder is right here, sales by location map. And how can we use the Folium library? Well, the first thing we need to do, and I might even just pull in something for this too, Folium, heat map, example. Okay, Folium.map, probably going to import it, pip install it, Folium map. You could do different types of tiles. I want a heat map. I don't need to see all these. Okay, so we ultimately need a data frame that has latitude, longitude, and a weight value. That's the three things that we need. That's basically what we want to replicate. Okay, so to import Folium like this. All these should be in the requirements.txt, so you should already have these. If you don't, just do a pip install of these different libraries. Okay, if we look at our data frame, we actually already have latitude and longitude there. So we basically just need the counts for those latitudes and longitudes to figure out our sales locations. So our counts in this situation would be the quantity ordered. And the heat map will be smart enough to find if you have similar latitudes and longitudes and similar quantity ordered by each other. Ultimately, the heat map will show those red zones. What we'll probably want to do is just go ahead and take we'll want to get our, how would we call this, def.plot US heat map. We would want to get our data frame, which is equal to the Reactive.Calc, and then maybe we have a smaller data frame that's just basically like heat map data equals data frame, latitude, longitude, and quantity ordered. Might want to get the values off of that. Let's print the heat map data real quick. And a good exercise would be to try to get this heat map working on your own before you see the final code. Where is this data? I guess this is maybe not getting rendered yet. So I could do render widget. Now we see the data. That looks good. That looks like heat map data. So from Folium, if I go back to that, the first thing we wanted to do was build a map. So that might look something like this. This is a latitude, longitude start location. You kind of have to play around with this, I would say, to figure out what works best, but it's a good starting point. Then we need to add data to that map. Well, to do that, we can do heat map, and then we can pass in the heat map data, and we want to add that to our map, and then ultimately we want to return our map. And so let's see what happens when we run this. It looks like we have some sort of error, and it tells us that it's having trouble turning it into an IPy widget, and it instead recommends using Shiny's render.ui decorator. So let's go ahead and try that. Render.ui. And wow, we got the location map working, let's go. I think one thing that's interesting is Folium versus IPython leaflet. This ultimately gives you an object that has like HTML source code all kind of built into it. If you printed map.representation HTML, you'd actually see all the HTML associated with this map get printed out. And I think as a result of that, like we can easily render this HTML. Render.ui is like the keyword, the annotation to use whenever you need to render HTML. And so something about this Folium library isn't friendly with IPython widgets, but it does have this HTML representation. So if you ever need to render HTML within your Shiny apps, render.ui is probably going to be what you need. And we see that we imported that over here, or I guess we're using it off of render. So that's cool to see. That's a nice chart for us. And let's see, I mean, that covers basically what we wanted to cover. We have everything here. It's really a matter of styling at this point, and that's what we're going to really focus on in the next video. But I think one final thing that's worth discussing is some different options we could use. Actually, there's a couple things I think are worth mentioning quick. So if you go to the documentation, I think there's some additional render annotations that are worth knowing. So one that we have actually already seen before is this render data frame. So we see it down at the bottom of our code. We're rendering this data frame. But I think one thing that is helpful to also know about rendering data frame is there's some additional customization options that we have available to us. One is there's these render data tables and render data grid. So I'll look at render data grid first. Basically, it gives us just a little bit more customizability of our data frame. So if I instead did render.DataGrid and then passed in the data frame or part of the data frame, as we see we're doing here, and then ran that, we're not gonna see any immediate changes, but this now gives me some customization options. One that I like is filters. So if I turn that to true and then look at our app, we're going to see now we have these different filters. So like if I only wanted MacBook Pros, I could type in MacBook Pro and we see we're only sorting by that. Maybe I only wanted addresses that include like San Francisco. So I could type in here. I could limit my quantity ordered to only like orders that were over 5 or something, or I guess maybe in our subsample we don't have any, but min 3 orders at a time. All sorts of nice filters you can do, especially when you have a bigger data frame. I only took the head of this data frame as a sample, but it can be very helpful to have filters. You could also render this instead of as a data frame, but as a table, which looks a bit different, and you could have a similar render data table option to give you the same customizability. Now if we look at the updated dashboard, I guess actually I think we pass this in normal. Render.table. We got a different looking table here. And you could have also done render.DataFrame and passed in render.DataTable. And you get something that looks like this. And you could also have passed in that same filters equals true. You get those options. You also could like make things editable here with the data table render. You could add a selection mode equals row, for example, and basically that then lets you highlight specific rows. It's all kind of personal preference, but if I run this again, now I can like click on these tables. So different options you have by using data table and data grid. Other things you might want to know about, go to the documentation. And there's like rendering text. So if you just want to render text on your screen, we might have seen this already. You can use the render.text decorator. You might want to render an image, let's say, in your dashboard. You can use the render.image. You could also render code. So if I find express.render.code somewhere here, I guess that the code is specifically, I remember seeing it in .core, render.code. If you needed to show code on your screen, you could use the render.code decorator. It's like the render.code, for example, if I did with UI.card, and I did at render.code, passed in show code, and then I just like returned code equals print hello we see that rendered here, if it's helpful to do. So things like that. I use the 3 code syntax if I needed to add a lot of code. I think one thing that might come here in the code range is syntax highlighting based on language, but not available currently. But you can play around with that. Cool. That's the basics. Really, really powerful to be able to render all these different types of charts in the same dashboard. really encourage you to play around with this and see what you can build. All right, that's all we're going to cover in this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to throw it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. In the final video in the series, we will see how we can style all of this and make it all look very nice and pretty. Again, all resources mentioned in this video are linked in the description. Check those out. Till next time, everyone. Peace. Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to see how we can incorporate some advanced styling using HTML, CSS into our Shiny for Python apps. So to get started, you can go to this GitHub link, and all of the code and video resources for each of the previous parts of these series can be found in the GitHub repo. But we're going to want to take the code from part 4, basically this app.py file, and start from there. As a reminder, basically in the last video, we had an app that looked like this, pretty fully built out, but it just lacks some nice styling. So in this video, we're going to see how we can turn this app into a more polished app that has, nice color scheme, etc., that looks like this. All right, let's get started. So I think a good starting point, I like to create a new branch to work off. So I'll call this video 5. Let's look again at what we're ultimately trying to do. Well, we have a dashboard that looks like this, and we're trying to convert it into one that looks like this. So I think that a good approach here is draw out what you want your design to look like, and then ultimately you modify your code to actually make that happen. So that's kind of what we're following. We have this polished final product, and we're trying to convert our existing code to mimic that. So I think it makes sense to start top down. So let's go ahead and start with this title and logo. How might we do that? Again, reminder, within Visual Studio Code, you can run this and see your app thus far. We ultimately want to now make this video 5 of 5. Looks good. And I think as a starting point, let's get some context on modifying HTML and CSS within our app before we actually modify this title. So within Shiny, we have really useful abilities to actually directly modify the HTML and CSS of our pages. So if you're not super familiar with the HTML and CSS, on any web page you ever browse on, you can right-click, and this is true in most browsers, and click Inspect. And then what that basically opens up is all of this HTML source code. So we can see that everything's kind of hidden within this body. We can see the different elements of our screen. So we can see that this H2 tag is our title, and all of these different graphs are kind of found in these divs. And then additionally, if we pull this open, we also see the styles of all of this. So I could hide some of these things and you would see the style change. But this is our HTML and this is basically our CSS. So we can actually modify that directly within our Shiny for Python code and start doing some pretty cool things. To do this, I think a good starting point is to add a UI.tags.style attribute to your Python app. You could do this in the same file, or you could create a separate file to do this. But basically, anything that you put within this little element will modify the CSS in your app. So what might we want to do? Well, just for proof of concept, how about we change some of this visualization's background colors? I could inspect. I could see that we're in this div. I could see that we're in this sidebar. I can start looking at IDs of things. So we see we have this label class, control label. If I wanted to, let's say, change up the style of this label within HTML and CSS, I could do it via this. So what was that called again? The class was control label and the ID was city label. So if I did class control label, this period right here specifies a class in CSS. And then let's say I just wanted to do, as a proof of concept, background color is blue. Run this. We see the control label now has a blue background for all of these different elements. I could have also targeted just this city one by doing specifically city label right here, ID city label. So if I didn't want this one to change, but I only wanted this element to change, I could have done hashtag. So this now, the hash sign, forget what the pound sign, specifies an ID in CSS. And I could have done city label. I run this. We're going to see that this, oh, I spelled label wrong. If I spell this correct, we'll see that this is still blue, but that other label down here is no longer targeted by the class modification. Maybe I wanted to change the font size to be like 50px. So we'll see this label now get much bigger. You can do all sorts of customizations. Obviously, I will not leave it like this because maybe you have a different take, but I don't think that this looks particularly good right now. But it's cool to see that we can start modifying the style of random elements. What's even more useful than this, though, is that we can start giving elements on the screen. So for example, like this layout sidebar, I could give this full sidebar a class label, something like custom sidebar, how about? And now I can modify this whole sidebar, the attributes of it, by it's a class. So it's period, because whenever we're modifying classes, it's period. Custom sidebar. And we'll see that the font size within that sidebar, I don't think there's any real font, and the color should change. For whatever reason, it's not changing. But if you ever find that a color is not changing when you expect it to change, another little helpful hint is you can do this hashtag, or I keep saying hashtag, exclamation point important, and that will force the changes to take place. Again, making this blue does not help us much, but it's cool to know that we can do this. And that's by adding this class underscore. The reason we add the underscore is because in Python, class like this is a protected name. So basically to get around that, we have to do class underscore. And if you wanted to modify the ID, likewise, you would do ID underscore. And that would allow you to customize these specific elements. And you can do that with all UI elements within this. Like I could have passed in a class to our sidebar, which is just this portion of the sidebar, whereas the layout sidebar, I guess, defaults to this right section. You could have added a class there, etc. So all good to know. I'm going to remove this though for now, but it's good to see that this is possible. All right, so our goal right now with this first part is to modify this title. So in the final polished product, we had a logo in there and a white text with a blue background. The logo is right next to the title. So how can we make this happen? I'm going to start by going to posit.shiny. I want to go to the gallery. So shiny.posit.co/py. I'm actually going to go into, I think, components. And I'm looking to see how we can put in an image. I always find this components page super helpful. And as we see in this output section, there's a nice image. And lucky for us, this is already defaulting to the Shiny logo. So we see we have this code down here. This is using a checkbox. That's not really necessary for us. So we can just copy this and make modifications as need be. To grab this Shiny image, I've left that in the GitHub repo. You can go to the main page, and you can go into assets, and you'll find, if you're on the master branch, you'll find shiny logo.png. You can click on that and save image as to download it locally. I recommend putting it within your project repo. So if we look at our Shiny Python projects, we have the sales folder. I would recommend putting it in the sales folder. That's where our app.py is. And maybe we'll make a directory called images. I'm going to do a move or a copy, downloads shiny logo to our images folder. Now if we look in images, we see we have shinylogo.png. Super. All right, and now to incorporate that, we want to copy that little code snippet we were just looking at. Copy that, go into our Visual Studio Code. I don't really care where I put it to start with, so I'll just go ahead and put it at the top of my file. Copy this code too. I don't have that in here. I'll put it in here. And then we have ours not just in the directory, we have it in images and then shinylogo.png. We don't have this toggle, so we can just go ahead and return the image and see what that does. That looks pretty good to me, so I'm happy with that. But obviously it's not next to the title, so we'll have to play around with this a bit. Kind of moving into the next recommendation here is you can really utilize the HTML and CSS to your advantage here. What we could do is we could actually define our own divs, and by using divs strategically, it will make it a lot easier for us to strategically put this logo right next to our title. So I'm going to go ahead and do ui.div, and we're going to want to give this div a name, so I'll call this header container. And it will be the exact same. You can use ui.div, or you could also do ui.tags.div. I believe these are exactly the same. In the documentation, you'll probably see ui.tags.div, but little shorthand is ui.div. And we can put the logo within this div. It's going to be the exact same right now. But we can start then getting even more creative. Within this header container, we can put another div. We'll call this, and maybe the proper technique here would be giving these IDs. I'm not an HTML, CSS expert, so as long as you can customize this as you need, I'm not too picky whether you use classes or IDs. But I'll call this logo container. We'll put the logo in here. And then finally, we can do with ui.div, call this title container, how about? And then additionally, in addition to like ui.div, we could also do ui.h2 or tags.h2 and just pass in a title directly here. So I'll do ui.h2 and then make this sales dashboard video 5 of 5. This is starting to look better. I think the big issue we see here is now we have 2 copies of our title. If we open this up, you'll see that this also says sales dashboard right here. I kind of want to keep these page options set here, but instead of having this set as title, I'll make this now window title. Whatever this is won't affect this title down here, but it will affect what this tab says right here. So you can keep it as sales dashboard video 505, or you could just keep it like, write it as final sales dashboard, whatever you think makes sense here. But run this, now we'll see this title disappear. But we do see that we have some serious issues with how the logo's lined up. So maybe you're an HTML, CSS expert. I personally am definitely not. So I love to tap into kind of the latest and greatest tools to help me out with this type of thing. So I might just go ahead and like copy this code snippet and then go to your LLM, your favorite LLM of choice, like ChatGPT, for example, and I might write something like, can you make a white H2 title for me with a blue background and have it aligned side by side with my logo? And I might change this to, can you provide the CSS to make a white H2 title for me with a blue background and have it aligned side by side with my logo image? For reference, here is some Shiny for Python code that I'm using to help with this. Paste that in, whether you're using ChatGPT 4.0 or 4 or 3.5. Okay, so it gave me some CSS to use. I'm going to just copy this, see what happens out of the box, and make adjustments as needed. No longer need this custom sidebar. That was just kind of to show things. Run this. Let's see what happens. Getting a little bit better. I don't know why this is so far above this. Doing some inspection on this. You can sometimes play around with things right in here. I see that this logo container is taking up way more height than the title container. So I think if we make this header container a set size and adjust the logo container and the title container to fill it, that will probably help us out a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and make the header container, let's say like 60 pixels. So a header container we'll say has a height of 60 px. Let's see what happens now. And then I'm going to go ahead and say that logo container has a height of 100%. So because header container is above logo container, this should also make the logo container have a height of 60 pixels. And that's looking better. Definitely looking better. I think, though, this shiny logo is a bit too big. I don't know why exactly that's happening. Okay, actually, I see that the width is specified as 100 pixels here. I think we should probably just get rid of that and let it be whatever it's going to be. I guess now it's going to be absolutely massive. Trying to think here. Can I do 100% and then say that this is important? Or maybe we need to specify specifically the image tag, so we can do this two-step sequence to specify specifically the image tag. I could very easily specify that I want the image to be like 40 pixels. This is definitely going to work. I don't know if it will work. That looks a bit better. What if I made this now 100%? Okay, that doesn't work properly. I'm going to say that this is 40 pixels. This is, for me, this is kind of a bit of how I operate with HTML and CSS. It's a little bit of playing around with things. You could use ChatGPT more or Copilot more as needed. And then what I will do here is I'm going to add a little bit of padding. So if the logo container is 60 pixels and this is 40 pixels, to get it perfectly centered here, if I add a padding, which will pad everything around that div. If I add a padding of 10 pixels, we should get a perfectly kind of centered logo. Come on. Where are you, logo? Where did the logo go? Maybe it's getting confused because I didn't have a colon here. There we go. Look at that. That's pretty good. And I don't know if I want this margin right as big as that. If I make this 10, will it move it closer a bit? I think it did. Maybe what? I think that's the, I know I'm pointing at the screen, but you obviously can't see that. I think that's this distance right here. All right, that looks pretty good. Is it centered? Okay, it's left aligned, all of this. So I might like copy all of this and I might say, I've modified the style to this, but I still need the header container to be centered on the screen. Please add this. Okay, I think this justify content center should have our fix. Yeah, let's go. All right, we're almost there with the title. I really don't like this blue color. So going into our final app, I do like this blue that we ended up using in the final app. So I think if I inspect this, can I easily see the color here? Not sure if I can. What I typically do when I'm trying to figure out specific colors on the screen is I'll usually download like a Chrome extension. I think any browser that you use will probably have some sort of suitable extension. This is called Colorzilla, I think. Click on this. Now I have a color and I can just immediately take this and instead of saying that the background color is blue, I'll paste in this color And we get that nice color. It's not filling the full screen though, so maybe what would be smarter than specifically filling this for the H2 tag is I could just go ahead and have this fill for the entire body element of our HTML. And look at that. We got a much nicer looking title in my opinion. You could play around with that a bit more, play around with like the margins and the padding. I am pretty happy with this. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. I might just remove this border radius. Oh, that's just making, that won't actually affect anything here now that we have the background color the same. I just don't love this padding. I'm going to make this a bit small there. Can't tell if that's doing much. Yeah, I mean, like this is exactly what I'm saying. You can play around with this a bit more to get it exactly how you want, but I'm content with that. And that's some basics of HTML, CSS styling. All right, next, let's start customizing our different charts here. And really we play around with the colors, we play around with, this doesn't have any grid lines, whereas before this had some grid lines. Also the axis has changed, like these labels is a bit different, whereas these are nicely capitalized. So I think, again, starting top to bottom, let's play around with some of these things. All right, so going into our Altair graph, I think the first thing we want to do is remove chart lines. We want to change up the titles, etc. Again, work smarter, not harder. You could look at the documentation, but I might just honestly copy like my code. Okay, next, I want to modify an Altair graph. I want to remove grid lines, change my x-axis and y-axis labels to be capitalized. Maybe to be more clear by it to from month and quantity ordered to month and quantity ordered respectively. What else do we want to do? I want to make the font color blue, and let's specify a font we can use for all of our charts and of type Arial. And is there any other big changes we wanted to make? I think that's the main things that I see. Yeah, it's the main things that I see. I guess we maybe remove tick marks. Remove tick marks. Leave the numbers, just the actual mark. Here is the sample code I have. This is kind of how I craft a lot of these prompts. Copy this. And let's see what happens. Enter. This looks pretty good. So we can use this to Alt-X and Alt-Y to do the changes that we want. One thing I don't love, I'd rather just have this be like a generic one-size-fits-all thing. So I might just honestly pull that out myself as a variable. So let's go ahead, copy this, go in here, paste in the updated code, make sure it's at the right level of depth. I think it was right here. Okay, run this. We see that it did work. I don't love, why did the labels, the fonts not change colors? All right, adjusting the colors. Oh, title color, let's see. Okay, and I really don't like that this is all just defined here, so I'm going to pull this out as a variable. Call this font props, and I'll call this font props, so I don't have to change it in two places when I modify this. Run this again, and cool, that looks much better. I could do the same thing with the title, I'm sure. So where's the title defined? Title is here. Let's see if this works. Don't know if it will. Nope. I think I could define this as though alt.title. Then pass in the axis. Did that work? Come on. Title param says no. See, I can't figure things out, but I can keep asking ChatGPT to help me. And one thing I don't love this blue color. I would rather a darker color. So again, I might like, look at this. I might do the ColorZilla. I might pick like this color. Got it copied, and then I can paste in this color into here, into here. Now we have a better colored. You could play around with that more, maybe make it darker, but I like this color better than previously. Now the only question is, how do we change that title color? How can I change my title? Sales over time, dash dash. To use the same color as my axes labels. Good old ChatGPT. Yeah, configure title, looks like you could do it here. Add that to our code, and it's just, yeah, a little bit of make some changes and test it, and then figure out what you need to change and make some more changes. I will copy the same color. You could even make this color a variable if you wanted to, so you're not passing around this random hex code, but we'll see that this will hopefully do what we want. Look at that, looks good, cool. And how does that compare to our final? I think the only change I see is that these labels are horizontal instead of vertical. Again, I can just say make x-axis labels are like tick marks horizontal instead of vertical item labels. Looks like we can do label angle in this one. No. I think though if we made them both 0, it's totally fine because this one is already 0. Okay. You can decide whether this makes sense or not. Like, it looks terrible if it's smushed like this, but it looks good when it's spread out. So yeah, you be the judge if this makes sense. Double check that everything works. Cool. Looks like the Altair's good. So let's keep moving on. Let's make some modifications now to these lower charts. And so how do these compare? Well, if we look at our final one, this has a nice blue color spectrum. It also has no grid lines. It has no background color. Let's use this as reference because this is our actual code. So remove the grid lines, remove this background color, change up this to use a color spectrum, change up these labels to be proper. We probably could just remove the product label. And we want to do this for all of them. So again, I think that honestly the easiest thing to do here is to start with ChatGPT and just have that help you kind of accomplish some of your goals and then make tweaks as needed. Now I'm modifying a Plotly graph. I want to change my x-axis label from product to displaying nothing. I want my y-axis label to go from quantity ordered to quantity ordered. I want to remove the background color. I want to remove grid lines. I want to, what else do I want to do? I want to change the bar colors from a solid single color to a color spectrum of blues. Please implement these changes. I think that was all that we wanted to do. Okay, that looks good. Let's copy this. Paste it in. 1, 2, 3, here we go. Let's see what happens. That looks pretty good. I really don't like this legend that popped up. Can we still modify things? Yes. It's not showing me all my labels. That's weird. So the big changes was this color continuous scale was added, and it uses the quantity ordered color to help with that. But I don't like this legend. And I also want to be able to like replicate this stuff to move some of this stuff into like a function that I can use in these other tabs so I don't have a bunch of copied code. So I want to make a couple additional changes. There's an annoying legend showing up in the Plotly code. Please remove that from the graph. Also standardize the code into a function because I need to apply the same styles to other Plotly charts. Gray, I like this. Def style Plotly chart. We'll paste that up towards the top of our code. And then we can copy this and put it now into our let's see how this works. No, the chart's still there. Okay, so if ChatGPT doesn't work, I say go to handy dandy Google, remove legend from bar chart color spectrum, Plotly Express. Okay, we have a couple different options. You can update the traces, update layout, show legend. For the color bar, here we go. You can only use fig update layout color axis show scale. So fig update and then layout underscore is the same as fig.update layout and then the stuff after that, color axis show scale. So we can go ahead and add to our chart over here. Where's that function? We can add color axis show scale equals false, and I think that should remove it. Cool, look at that, it looks much better. We can add that. And now we can apply this to the other ones to get those to copy the style. If we look at our final code, or final dashboard, we see that we do use reds for lowest sellers and lowest sellers value. So I do want to make sure we apply that, but I think that should be a pretty simple change. And then the only other thing I might recommend here is, this is kind of annoying here, this bar. I just feel like maybe you would want to hide this. Like if you're sharing this dashboard, like they don't need to know the Plotly controls that you can do here. So if we inspect this, we see we get this mode bar here, class mode bar. We can just, as before, you saw before, we can go ahead and add something like class mode bar, display none, and just hide this completely. So now if you hover, it doesn't show up. So maybe that's something you want to do, but it's just cool to see how you can apply this HTML, CSS changes to like help just clean up some things. But what did we want to do? Well, I forget what I said. Oh, we wanted to just apply these styles to the other ones. Okay, I'm going to copy just basically this snippet of code and apply to the others. So this one uses value now instead of that should modify the second one. Looks good. And then I guess the y-axis label, oh shoot. Now there's a different y-axis label for quantity ordered. I'm going to pass this in as another field. Okay, now we've modified it to have different titles based on different things. That looks good. We can now copy this into the last two. So this one, paste it in here. Then instead of this blues, I think if we just did reds, it will be totally fine. I think that's also a default option. Looks good. And then finally, copy this, paste it in here, do the reds again here. And I think the final change is maybe we would want to standardize this font to be like the same blue. So I might just go back to the ChatGPT window. And I modify the font to be Arial size 12 with a blue color that has color, what was that hexadecimal code that we had before? It was this. And I might just make a variable at the top of our screen called like font color, just so we can standardize and just use this variable if we ever want to change fonts. Okay, cool. We can add this to our style plotly chart code. Look at that. Now we got a nice change in color. Looks good. And if I wanted to just clean this up a bit, I could pass in font color to all the places that use it. You could also do the same with font type and make that Arial, set to Arial. Cool. All right, that is the second chart. Now let's move to the heat map. What is the differences between the heat maps? With our final one, we have it all blues. So same type of process I would repeat. I would do something like, okay, where's our heat map? Okay, we got our heat map here. And I did actually just notice an issue. This is not hour of day. This is our day, and this is order count down here. So I just need to switch the labels. And I think in our final, we didn't actually include the title because we already have kind of the title up here. So I'm going to remove the title. Cool. So we have this, paste it into ChatGPT. I have the following code. I want to have the font changed to use the color font color and use font type Arial. And I want the color spectrum to be all blues, different shades of blues. Please make changes. So this is kind of a standard like ChatGPT workflow and how I kind of access things these days. So it looks like we can pass all of this into our Because it makes sense to make a variable for this too. And I feel like there's a, kind of a one downside of making these stylistic changes sometimes is it's hard to keep them neat as you start adding more and more things. So I'm kind of going through this quickly, but I would kind of recommend, after you complete this type of stuff to kind of look through, see if there's ways you can move different aspects into different files or just clean up different details of this. Okay, so now we have this in the blue font as well. It looks good, but it didn't use the blues. How can we get the blues? Looks like we can do sns.light palette like this. Let's see what happens when we do this. Looks like it works. It's not the same exact blues as I showed before. I'm curious. This is the type of difference that I'm going to just double check what I had before. Looks like I just used what was called blues before. So I'm going to just copy this as blues. See what it does there. That looks better. I like that. Look at that. Then we also want to change these to be shades of blue. So again, just keep repeating the same type of process. I have this Folium heat map. I want to make the colors of the heat map only shades of blues. Make modifications to the code to use this color spectrum. Okay, that looks straightforward enough. Let's see what happens here. I don't love the blues here. I think it's hard to see the differences. I'd rather use like the same spectrum that we used here. So I might honestly like open this up. I might highlight these different colors. So like, what is the max color here? Like this. I might change the max color to this nice one. I might change the min color to the lightest thing here. This, maybe like this. Then I might now go back to ChatGPT and say, I've modified the 0.2 and 1.0 of the spectrum. Please fill in the other values to be between these. I wonder if this will work. I'm very curious. Let's see. I feel like this is hard to, maybe, I don't know. You can play around with this a bit. Maybe it looks a little bit better. I'm going to just copy in whatever I had previously in my final draft. Oh, it looks like I had a 0.02. Maybe that helps. I don't know. Yeah, I like the kind of lighter colors a bit more, but yeah, whatever your preference is, it doesn't matter too much. That's the heat map. I think we have about everything. I think the only thing that we might want to change now is this bar color is slightly different. I will use this bar color. Okay. Going back to Altair graph, make the bars of the bar chart use this color. There's a mark bar here. Just copy this. Oh, it's already there. Just need to add the color. All right, what happens there? Cool, now we got this nice color here. I'm pretty happy with this. I think we mostly covered the different changes that we saw in our final app. That looks good. I think one change I might make is first I'll commit this. Git diff, git add sales or app.py, git commit, made final changes to style. And then I might also run black app.py to reformat it. Reformatted with black. Cool. Well, this was some styling. This was ultimately, we built a pretty cool app. And I think that we walked through a ton of skills that you can really take and adapt to whatever you think makes sense on your own. Really run with these skills. You know, take templates from Shiny. But I found that these Shiny dashboards are super powerful. You can build all sorts of really cool stuff and deploy them super easily. So I've been very excited playing around with Shiny and making dashboards like this. Hopefully you found that this series was helpful. If you did enjoy this video or any videos in the series, it'd mean a lot if you throw this one a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Would also be very curious what types of dashboards you would love to see in the future. So leave comments with suggestions down below. But until next time, everyone, this was fun. Peace. Thank you for watching, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed this course. If there's certain types of applications, dashboards that you would love to see built with Shiny for Python, I would love to hear them down in the comments. I definitely plan to build more with Shiny and other Posit products in the near future. Also, if you have any lingering questions or best practices that you want to know, also feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to kind of monitor and answer the high-level questions that I see. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean a lot if you throw it a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. These courses take a while to prepare, so my small ask to all of you is just the like button, subscribe. It helps allow me to keep making courses such as this one. Again, thank you to Posit for sponsoring this video. If you need a solution to deploy applications like the one we built in this course to your organization, share it with external and internal stakeholders, check out Posit Connect, linked in the description. All right, without further ado though, that's all we have for this one. Till next time, everyone, peace out.